Okay, our book is Second Corinthians tonight, and I was looking after we talked last week where we've come since we started. We finished all 39 books of the Old Testament, and now we've done, this would be our 8th, I think. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts, Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians. So this is our 47th week that we've actually met and did a book at the glance. How many books are in the Bible?
66, is it?
Yeah, 66. So, wow, we're tracking along. We're doing really, really good. That's a lot of, it's hard to imagine all those weeks. So, and to think that this week the book is Second Corinthians, and that's my favorite book that we've done. So it is amazing. It really is. Lord, I've just been blessed reading it this week, and I've fallen deeply in love with it. It's a very personal letter from Paul, and it's written differently. 1 Corinthians, which we looked at last week, was a letter that Paul had written after he had visited Corinth. The first time he'd spent 18 months there. Remember last week we talked 18 months there. He had left and he went down to Ephesus, and he spends about 2 years there. He'll be stoned and left for dead and everything. It's a rough trip, but in the midst of being down there, he'd left Timothy there, and Timothy came and some others came and told him about what was going on down in Corinth, and he wrote that first letter, and it's kind of a rough letter. It's got a lot of correction, and they got a lot of things wrong, and in the midst of that, he stops and writes that love chapter, writes the sweetest chapter in all the Bible in the midst of 1 Corinthians that we read, and so he sent the letter with a young man, not Timothy this time, but a young man named Titus. And Titus takes the letter down to Corinth and sets up teaching there. So when you look at what's went on in Corinth, to build into this second letter, which is kind of the finale for us all, Paul went there. There was no church. So when he went there as an evangelist. He lived with Priscilla and Aquila, two very important names in the Bible when you read in Acts, and impressive names. So he had partners. He lived with them because they also made tents, and he could make a living, and then he could preach, and he'd go down to the temple and preach. But he was waiting on Silas and Timothy, two other big names in the Bible, to come and help him out. And when they get there, things kind of break out, and he moved out of into a house of Justin, or he started a home church, so to speak, it seems like to me, and started preaching to the Greeks and the Gentiles. So the whole ministry changes. So when he leaves and he sends this letter back, he's not sending it to the synagogue, he's not sending it to the Jews and the leadership of Corinth, so to speak. He's sending it to the members of that home church that grew. And so he sends it to Timothy, and there's a big difference if someone was going to write a letter to the church here, and they was going to write it to the members of the church, or if they was going to write it to the deacons and the pastor, how that would be written. And the reason I bring that out is that 2 Corinthians then is written to the leadership of the church. And it's a whole different style of letter than 1 Corinthians. So he leaves and he sets up, and Timothy comes and he sends that letter with Titus down to Corinth to see how they'll respond. He's got some things he's asked them to do. Remember, there was questions they had asked him, and there was some people that Chloe had come and told him some problems there, and he had dealt with all that. And he had told them that he was going to come and visit them again. And that hadn't happened. Time had delayed, and he hadn't heard anything from Titus. I think it's in chapter 7 in 2 Corinthians. he goes and finds Titus. Titus has left Corinth, but he's still over there in Crete in that area. He leaves a successful ministry that he when he's talking about it in 2 Corinthians, said, I left. God was blessing and everything. And I went and found Titus because he wanted to know the response of Corinth to the First Corinthian letter. He's wanting to talk to him to see how they responded. When you read 2 Corinthians, you'll find that the members, the people of Corinth, the church, that group out of Justin's house, responded well. They had responded in trying to accomplish and do some things that Paul wanted them to do, or Paul was pleased with what he had heard from Titus. But along with the response, filters news out of Corinth that there's, how would we say it today, some new sheriffs in town. There's a new group in town, and they're running Paul down. And one thing that they say of Paul is, listen, he's not who he said he is. And you read, and remember why I'm teaching you this? To get you to read 2 Corinthians, right? 2 reasons they say Paul isn't what he claims to be. Number one, he said he was going to come, and he hasn't come. And so in 2 Corinthians, you'll hear Paul, you'll be reading along, and he'll say, listen, when I was in town and preaching Jesus Christ, it wasn't yay and nay, and I wasn't all over. And he goes, you keep reading yay and nay back and forth. He just keeps using it, and then verses get kind of confusing to you, but slow down and read them. What he's saying is, when I was in town and I was there preaching, and I preached Jesus, there was no wishy-washy stuff about me. I didn't come to you in the flesh, and you had to wonder whether I meant what I said or not. I was always clear and upright. And then he goes on and he explains how he wanted to come, but he didn't want to come to them in anger, he says in 2 Corinthians. And he said, listen, there had been some positive things happen down there in Corinth, but everything hadn't been fulfilled in Corinth. One major thing that he's waiting to be fulfilled, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So he delayed his coming. He wasn't being wishy-washy, and them people that was saying he's dealing with that, okay? The second thing is, and I love this, and if you think of Paul, we think of him differently probably than he appeared. If we would have met him or we would have known him, we might have had a little different opinion of him. I have one instruction of some of the history or things of people that put together. They said if you would have met Paul, you would have met a guy that was very much bald. You would have met a very short guy. He would have had crooked legs, because they got reasons behind all this, that his eyes would have been dim and his brow would have been connected. What do they call that, a unibrow? Yeah. You go, oh, Paul, whoa. And he would have had a crooked nose, they said. And I was reading that and I'm going, no wonder Paul was still single when he's writing all these letters. Maybe it wasn't all just being set aside. Maybe there's some things about him. So I was laughing, I'm sure, when they're attacking him. Because the second thing they say about him is that he writes a really strong, powerful letter. But in person, he's not the same guy. That's what they say. And he deals with that in 2 Corinthians. It's neat to listen. He's kind of excited about coming, needless to say, and he deals with, when he comes again, I want you to understand when you're reading it, this is not to the members of the church. This is to the leadership, okay, of the church and the religious and the boss and all those in Corinth. The members are doing well, but some of them are beginning to waver. They're beginning to wonder, Paul had not came. And maybe he did just write tough letters. What do we see today? What does the news, the media do to us all the time? They really believe if you hear something enough, eventually what? You'll believe it's true if it isn't combated. Paul's miles and miles away. He can't run down and combat. And they're battering him and they're beating him. So what's his solution? Well, he can run back down there. But his idea is I'll write a second letter to the leadership to be circulated in Corinth before I make my next journey. And so he does. He writes that second letter and he sends it back to Corinth to deal with the things that are being said about him, okay, to deal with some doctrinal issues that they're having. And then there's one specific thing in here that I never had caught, and others have, and you may have, but sometimes when you're reading and you've been reading the Bible all your life and you're reading and something jumps out to you, just go, oh, that's so good. But in studying these back to back, remember in 1 Corinthians when he wrote, he was talking about their carnality and how bad and rotten they were and how they had that one guy in the church that was even living with his mother-in-law. There he's talking about that, and he says, being absent in the body but present in the flesh, I've already judged this. And he said, you need to kick him out of the church, that his flesh will be, you might lose him physically, but spiritually his soul might be saved. He writes that real rough and tough, and that in 1 Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians, in chapter 2, turn there with me. In chapter 2, verse 5. And I'll read this whole little section here, and I want you to think about that story. Again, so we get it in perspective. He went there, right? He started a church. He left. He heard of this guy in that church that's way off. And the church isn't doing anything about it. And he writes in the strongest terms. Listen, his soul matters. His spirit matters. But you've got to get this dude out of your church. And he sends that. That's sent to them in a letter. He's not there talking to them. He then runs into Titus, right? And he later writes this letter. Listen to these words, verse 5. But if you have caused grief, he hath not grieved me, but in part that I may not overcharge you all. Sufficient to such a man is the punishment which was inflicted of many. So they punished someone. And he's going, now listen, hey, so I don't be grieved, and so things ain't overdone. And he's talking to them. They obviously, there's some kind of communication here that they know what he's talking about, who he's talking about. He doesn't have to write the name here. It's clear. They're going to understand. He goes, sufficient to such a man is the punishment which was inflicted of many of you, so that counterwise ye ought rather to forgive him and comfort him, lest perhaps such a one should be swallowed up with overmuch sorrow. Wherefore I beseech you that you would confirm your love towards him. For to this end also did I write. So he's writing to them about something, okay, I wrote to you about this, that I might know the proof of you, whether ye be obedient in all things or not. He's saying, listen, I wrote to you about this guy, wondering whether you'd even listen. And so you were obedient. You listened. I can't imagine he isn't being allowed to do that without some kind of connections in the church, right? I mean, they aren't allowing this kind of sad character to carry on. There's something there. So Paul writes and goes, listen, whatever you're holding on to keep him in church, you need toughen up and get him out of there and get him out of there now. And he wondered whether they'd even do it. And they did. And guess what? It worked. This is a victory. Paul's writing to go, listen, guys, he repented. He changed. You got to forgive him now. Now they did that. He repented. He quit. He changed. He wants to come back to church, and they won't let him. They're going, no. And so Paul writes, whoa. Now, to complete the perfect story of how grace and God works, now you got to open your arms back up. This is Paul writing the same church about a guy he said, kick him out, saying, let him in. Isn't that beautiful? And I'd never caught that. But I'm almost certain, because he says this is about who I wrote you about. And don't overcharge, don't overdo. Let him back in. And then Satan, because Satan's going to win now on this side. Because what's going to happen? That guy's going to eventually get angry, right? He's going to get angry outside the church and say, listen, yeah, I messed up. But where's the love? Where's the chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians in this church that I can change and come back? And you'll accept me and love me and restore me. Isn't that? I said this is a beautiful story for the church. Beautiful story for the church. To see how it should work. That sometimes, was it last week that I told you there's going to be a time in your life when you may have information you have to share. And it's going to hurt, right? And I said you might even have to give your name. But wasn't able to share that, listen, it may cause a split. It may cause some damage. But there's a reason behind that, right? If done according to 1 Corinthians 13 with love, the end is reconciliation. And here's an example that church discipline done properly can work. But it not only takes change on the part of the person, it takes love on the part of the church. Because sometimes we find it hard to believe people really can change. Is there anyone better to preach about change than Paul? It doesn't take long reading 1st, 2nd Corinthians to almost forget he once was Saul. He once was a hater of the church and hater of Christians. And the church hated him. But then when he saw Jesus and he came to the saving knowledge, he had a hard time finding those open arms. Remember, he started out being let down over the wall in the evening in a basket. So, because no one wanted him. But finally, the church threw their arms around him. And when the church threw their arms around him, who put their arms out? His old family, his old friends said, we don't want nothing. And they sought Paul, right, to destroy him. He knew what it was to be left out and to be accepted. And so when he sees this, I think it's special that he includes this one individual man, his problem in letter 1, but his victory in Jesus in letter 2. And if you were to circle that in chapter 2 as a reminder, because sometime maybe in life when you do face that time, or maybe someone comes to you and says, listen, I don't like what you're doing. I think you're doing wrong, and I think you need, or you want to do something and they won't let you in the church sometime, somewhere, and they say, listen, you just need to do more of this, or, this is holding you back, and maybe then you might be angry, and who knows what happens, but comes a time when all that gets reconciled and you can love one another. That's the perfect picture. That's the perfect picture of the church. And Paul's great at it. Paul's tough. He don't look it. And those people think they can bluff their way out? Why he isn't there and say, nah, when he isn't, and he's in person, he's weak. He doesn't have it. Boy, he can write. But in person, he's just not the same person. They're wrong. He's got the heart of a great leader. I've heard this said of pastors and great leaders, particularly pastors in churches. And you might want to remember this. I'm going to be getting a new one. That a pastor needs to be a person with a child's heart. The ability to love any and all innocently. And needs to have a scholar's mind. Needs to be able to think and work all the way through things. This is the part I like the most. And needs to have the hide of a rhinoceros, they say. Because, man, do you hear? I loved, I think it was Charles Swindoll said one time, he said, there isn't anything like your job working with troubled people who cause trouble. Right? And that, in some ways, is part of leadership in a church. You know, you got troubled people, broken people, who, people always accuse us of being hypocrites in church because there are no perfect people here. So we all have our troubles, we all have our struggles, and we come together, and I think Paul had that absolutely perfect. And you see that in this letter. In chapter 1 of 2 Corinthians, verse 8, tells you, and us, I'm going to ask you, what comes to mind when you hear his explanation of how he feels, okay? He says, for we would not, brethren, have you ignorant of our trouble. Their trouble. Whose trouble is their trouble? Paul, all right? Which came to us in Asia, that as we passed out of measure above strength, inasmuch as we despaired even of life. When I read that and I looked at Louise, I said, oh, that reminds me of one word, suicidal. Not saying Paul was, and that would offend some people. But when you're despairing of life, it's heavy. It's weighing on him big time. He faced lots and lots of troubles. And when you get to chapter 12, he says, listen, amongst all of my troubles, I also had divisions. And he's saying, I never ever forgot that road to Damascus when I was on the wrong road and I ran into Jesus. That was the added blessing that God gave me. When people say, I saw the light, Peter literally did. So bright, it knocked him off of the donkey and he was blinded. Remember Ananias leading him? But that was a vision. He said, I've had visions. And he said, when he says, I have visions, he's saying, I remember that there was a time when I received a vision of a man from over Macedonia crying out to me when I was struggling, trying to figure out which way to go in ministry. And I had this vision of this man, this angel coming to me and saying, come over here to Macedonia to us. Because this is an added blessing to have things like this in your life, he said. He goes, now whether I was in the body, he said, or out of the body, I don't know. But I ascended, he said, into the third heaven. That's the big one. That's not the sky. That's not the atmosphere. That's heaven, the third heaven. He said, I don't know whether I was awake, asleep, dreaming, how it was, but he said, But I ascended to the third heaven. You know what his explanation of that was? Eye hath not seen nor ear heard what the Father has in store for you guys. I can't even explain. So he in chapter 12 says, listen, I've had visions in life. I've had troubles. I've been stoned. I've been shipwrecked. I've been left to die. And then he says in chapter 12, and I've had a thorn. Thorn in my side, so to speak, all ministry long. And 3 specific times, he said, I went to the Lord about that. And I don't know whether he fasted and set aside time to go to the Lord, but 3 times in his life, he said, I went to the Lord and I said, Lord, if I can have anything, would you remove this from me? 3 times, he says. And the Lord's answer all 3 times was, nope, nope, nope. Put that together. I've had visions. And then he goes on to say, but the Lord has used this thorn and kept me humble. And that's where we get that key verse where the Lord says to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, Paul. I'm not removing the thorn, but I'm going to give you the grace to deal with it. And he never went back to him the 4th time. And it never got removed, that we know. The great apostle Paul dealt with that. When he writes 2 Corinthians, he gets after it when he talks to those guys, and he gets down and tender when he's talking to the people. Listen, I've despaired of life, he said. I think it's chapter 8, 4 or 8, he goes, listen, I've been in despair. I've been knocked down, but I ain't been kept down. I've been, so to speak, I've had strike 3, but I never ever counted myself out. And he gives this whole list of things that happened, but I've never quit, Paul said. He gives that list, and I think it's amazing to read and look at when you look at his life. This is a unique book. He deals with these people in a very powerful way. He's straightforward with them. He promises he's coming, and that we'll see how weak I am when I get there. That old saying, be careful what you ask for, probably was true of Paul. I find it amazing how the Lord works in mysterious ways. I'm sure a lot of churches in that day and time were jealous of the church at Corinth. Paul had already written him 2, possibly 4 letters, and some churches had not got any as of yet. And, you know, many churches that Paul started never did get a letter. But this church, this particular church, remained on his heart. And this people on his heart. He said to them, he goes, listen, you look around you there in Corinth. There isn't many wise or rich or powerful people in the churches. We're not the top of the line when the world looks around and says, this is the class. But we do love the Lord. And I think that's all Paul ever looked for. And I think that's what churches should look for, right? It's just a deep, deep love for the Lord. I've found over the years in ministry that the church that is loving Jesus is the healthy church. It doesn't matter what the numbers are. It doesn't matter at all. It matters what the heart is. In Europe, there was a name, I think they call his name Percy S. He was very wealthy. And when he died, came the day for the will to be read, and the same day they were going to have an auction and auction all the stuff off. And so all the people came to the auction and to the reading of the will. And the guy come out, caretaker of the will, what do they call him? Who does the will? Executor come out, and he said, well, he said, Percy asked that I do one thing. He said, he said, I read the will, or before we begin, he said, there's just one act of business. And he went over and he picked up this big portrait of Percy's son that had died years ago. Percy had got a painting of him. It wasn't very good at all, portrait painted. And he said, he asked me to start out the auction, and before we read the executive he said, the auction, and this will be the first item we auction. So he said, who'll give me $1,000? I'll just kind of let you know this go, and shook their head, and finally one, I think it was a second cousin in the back, looked at the portrait and thought, well, it's Percy's son, and it's not a good portrait, and it's big, but hey, and he raised his hand and he said, I'll give you 1,000. He said, well, who'll give me 1,500, 1,400? Can I get 1,300, 1,200, 11? Sold $1,000 to the cousin in the back. He said, now, folks, he said, this concludes our day, and you all can go home. He said, what do you mean? He said, Percy said everything he has goes to the one who buys the portrait of his son. I tell you that tonight to close by saying, if you want to move God's heart, you got to love the Son. That's what Paul did so well. That's why he was so successful. Had tough hide, yes he did. Had a heart of a child and a mind of a scholar. But he loved the Son, and so when you stoned him, when you tried to drown him, when he got snake bit, when he got hated, when he got imprisoned, just kept writing about the Son. And God just kept blessing. And so, as we close tonight, there's struggles in your life. There's battles. And you're reading 2 Corinthians, you might remember this. Maybe you need to refocus your love on the Son. Maybe the Father's put a portrait up of his Son at Calvary and saying, where's your interest? Is it in titles, in names and positions, in fame and fortune? Or is it in just, I love the Son? I think
That guy probably hung that portrait right up in the house.
I bet he did. I think that's the same thing we should do with the portrait of Jesus in our heart. I do. I believe that God looks and says, listen, he who wants a blessed from me. Hey, fast if you will. Pray, and you must. Read your Bible, and you should. Be faithful to the church, and why wouldn't you? But love the Son. Love the Son. Love Jesus. I am always believe that's got to be the center, not only of your personal life, but of your church. When you sing what you want to sing, and the length of time, and the color of the walls, and all that, but love Jesus. Does your church push for the love of Jesus, and you'll be okay. Let the love for the Son fade, and I think God dismisses and looks for those that are willing to love the Son. Hey, that was preaching there. That was free for those of you watching the Bible study. You don't owe for that one at all. Any thoughts or questions?
I know some scholars say, I'm talking about Paul's thorn in the flesh, that thinks it was his eyes, because a lot of times he'd write, he'd had other people write his, he'd dictate and they would write, and one time he said, see how big I wrote, you know.
Big
so
letters, yeah.
And another one, he says, you would have given me your eyes, he goes, if it was possible.
Yeah.
I forget who he was talking to.
I think in one of the beliefs, and of course, when you're reading, God gave you an imagination, and I think it adds. Now, when you're teaching, you got to be really careful not to teach what you imagine to be fact. And it's really hard sitting here sometimes to say, oh, this is fact, when I can imagine things. But I imagine, when I think of Paul and his sight, and that quite possibly that would have been. The other thing is, if his legs were bad, and the ability to travel in that day and time, walking, you know, would have been a big thing. Being on missionary journeys and stuff would have been big. But I often wondered, did the stoning where they left him for death? I mean, when they stone you so much that they drag you out of the city and leave you for dead, they didn't just hit you with a little rock and leave. And I wondered, did that, I could see him being double visioned, that kind of thing being hit. If I had to guess, but it would be a guess, because of course we don't know, I would absolutely agree, because the one thing he writes about, and he talks about when he says, look how big a letters I wrote, is his sight, and he wrote most of the Bible. So I'm sure he's thinking, Lord, can't you take this from me? I can write 10 times the letters, and I could sit here and I could write to all the churches, and I could share, and there's things he wants to say. Just read these. There's things he wants to tell these people in his heart, and he can't. So I could see him sincerely going to the Lord and going, I just don't understand, Lord. Why won't you take this from me? I will use my vision for you. I could see that being it. That would be, if I had to guess, that would be my guess, and when I imagine. That's
Gary was stoned many times, weren't you?
I wear glasses.
Okay. Now that's on tape. We will not say his last name. Okay. Any other questions?